This is going to be a somewhat disappointing seminar, I'm afraid. I'm certainly going to be disappointed. I had hoped to be much farther along in this research than I am. A couple of notes of background. I've actually been thinking about and writing outlines and making tables for this paper for over 3 years now. This is a paper that there's really no good time to write because you keep wanting to add new information, and because new information keeps changing the story every bit, just a little bit, not a whole lot. And so that's one of the problems I have here. I am also wrestling with the idea I'm trying to tell a story, a big story picture or a big picture story about how recent Thai economic performance has evolved and how it has affected everyday Thais, the average Thai worker, the average Thai consumer, Thai investors, and so on. And so because I have a lot of material to go through and I need to help you or give you time to help me get some focus at the end of this, I'm just going to share my screen for most of the presentation and walk through this outline and a set of tables that I have with it and were distributed yesterday. At the end, I'll also share a new conclusion that I have written this morning. The whole question I'm asking here is how and why has economic growth slowed in 21st century Thailand? First, to document the slowing in the abstract and in the introduction, during a boom period or the end of the economic boom, which began about 1985 or 86. But for the first half of the 1990s or a little more, economic growth was extremely high, with per capita GDP growing at 6.7% annually, which is not quite enough to double every 10 years, but it is quite a lot. Then there was the Asian financial crisis. The economy contracted. It didn't really recover per capita GDP, real per capita GDP levels until 2002. So in a sense, they lost 6 years because of the crisis. But actually, a fairly robust recovery had begun by 2000. And the growth rate during a recovery period was a reasonable 4.8% in per capita terms, or closer to 6% in real terms. The question is, why did it then fall to 2.7% in 2006 to 2019? And in most of these years, it's been quite low. There have been a couple of years with 4 or 5% growth, but nothing like the pre-crisis period, and nothing even like the recovery period. And for Thailand, which still only has per capita GDP a little over $7,000 in the last few years at current US dollars and current exchange rates, the relevant question is, don't you need another decade of relatively rapid growth if you want to achieve your economic development goals? I would be one that would tend to think that would be a very reasonable and understandable goal for most policymakers in Thailand to try and proceed to go get. Now, one of the important things in the background, of course, is the Asian financial crisis, which caused all this dislocation, and we'll talk about that a bit more when I get to the conclusion. What I want to do right now is I'm just going to jump into these indicators and walk through them one by one with you. I'll try to get through them as quickly as possible and come back to the big story and the conclusion. And what I've done in the outline, as you've seen, is I've gone through and tried to outline points that I think are important to write about when I go back and write this up, points that I don't want to forget. The first couple of points have just been made. One of the most important points that I emphasize in the conclusion, but I haven't done consistently and systematically enough in the text yet, is the fact that the Asian financial crisis and then the world financial crisis both had similar effects in that they greatly reduced the appetite for risk among lenders and borrowers in various economies. The effects of the Asian financial crisis were, of course, much larger in Thailand and had much more direct effects on Thailand because, in fact, in many respects, Thailand was ground zero for the Asian financial crisis, along with Indonesia and Korea. And Indonesia and Korea in particular shared a problem that was common in the United States that before the world financial crisis, in that a certain group or groups of lenders, important and big lenders, important and big borrowers, had strong incentives in the system to lend irresponsibly, borrow irresponsibly, and regulators did not regulate the markets, the credit markets, very well. So quickly, large levels of non-performing loans accumulated, and this broke the back of several important financial institutions. The point here is not what happened during those crises or the cause of that, but the overhang of that, or the hangover, if you will, was mainly seen in the behavior of lenders and borrowers. They both became extremely risk averse. Lenders were hesitant to lend, borrowers were hesitant to borrow. They had both been burned during the crisis. And of course, regulators became more risk averse as well, and regulations tightened. So you've never seen a recurrence of that kind of NPL problem in Thailand. But the world financial crisis had a much bigger effect. And one of my fundamental theses about the world economy right now, and this is very important, is that we have just lived through 15 years of the strangest economic years modern people are ever going to experience, in the sense that we have had 15 years of uninterrupted, almost zero interest rates, with 15 years of almost uninterrupted, very loose monetary policies in the world's major economies. And against that backdrop, it's no wonder we're having some inflationary issues now. On the other hand, I think if you're a central banker in Tokyo, or even in the Fed in Washington or elsewhere in the United States, you're actually rather happy about the inflationary pressures now. And I think cautiously optimistic you'll be able to control them. But the point that I need to make when we're considering Thai performance in 2006 to 2019, which is the period I want to focus on most, is that this was a very, very strange period with very, very strange credit conditions. And those strange credit conditions certainly are a potential important reason for slow growth in Thailand and slow growth in other countries. They were also reasons for rapid growth in some countries. But Thailand, being a small, open economy, which I'll emphasize later, they were very open to influences from abroad. If you look at the structure of demand, a couple of things you might worry about are seen in the structure of consumption, as shares of commodity groups that you would normally consider necessities of sorts don't seem to be declining. On the other hand, it's quite clear that the commodities that make up those groups are much higher quality than they are now. And that may explain one of the reasons the values of those expenditures, and I calculate these shares in current values, not in deflated values, because I don't really trust the price deflators. That might be one of the reasons the values of those items remained high. Rising shares of vehicles and restaurants and hotels also indicate greater extending on necessities and greater welfare among Thai households. One of the biggest, most conspicuous changes after the financial crisis has been a very pronounced and continuous decline in private fixed investment, particularly private fixed investment used for construction. If you look, I think you can see table 1 right now, and I'm highlighting shares of private investment in construction and in equipment. And you see both of them go dramatically down after 1996. The second column, I periodized growth performance here, and I'm focused primarily on 3 periods. I'm looking at 90 to 96. I'm looking at the recovery period, 2000 to 2006. I call 90 to 96 the boom period, more precisely the end of the boom period. And then the last period I look at is what I call the slow growth period of 2006 to 2019. And again, the growth was markedly slower after that. I ignore the inter-crisis period because I don't think I have much to say about it, and I don't think it has that much relevance for long-term growth performance, except for this long-term hesitancy that I see spilling over to lenders and borrowers in credit markets and how that affects private fixed investment. And I think one of the ways that I might want to try and expand this discussion is to see if I can estimate some investment models that might be able to describe some of that process. But I don't know if I have the correct kind of data to answer the questions I want to. The other important point, of course, is that Thailand is a economically small, meaning it does not control world prices in the vast majority of markets, and it is very heavily dependent on trade, and particularly after 2000, export to GDP ratios, import to GDP ratios, both rose as high as 60% in some years. And even after recent declines, they remain close to 50%. If you look at the structure of production, one thing that sticks out during the period is the relative stability of major industrial sectors. Agriculture, manufacturing is constant, more or less constant. It's somewhere between 27 and 31%, and you don't really see a clear trend one way or the other to 2019. I'm not really keen. 2019 is here, excuse me. The last column is 2020, all right? You do see a bit of a decline in recent years, suggesting some kind of deindustrialization. I'm not sure if that's the appropriate word for it. I would like to calculate that in real terms to see if using deflators makes a big difference. The other thing that's important is to look at the share of agriculture. It also remained remarkably constant over the long term, though there was a large decline in the last few years.
Excuse me, Eric? I was wondering if you could show the tables instead of the text of the paper.
Yeah.
You're showing the text right now, not the tables.
Oh, really?
Thank you.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I have to share. How do I share? Where do I share? I got to go back to the inefficient way of doing things. Okay. But the point is that although you had these dramatic changes in the structure of demand, particularly with the reduction in private fixed investment demand, and these large fluctuations, large increases and decreases in export and import, you had relatively stable production structure. Although some industries, you saw a steady decline here in the value of trade, at least through most of the period. You see transport and storage also being stable. Across these broad economic sectors, well, down in finance insurance, that's growing, but I'm very suspicious of this growth and the way they measure it. And also, I'm very suspicious about the definition in real estate, which I have to find out a little more about. But these 7 service industries are the major industries in Thailand. If you add up all these shares, they account for all but the last 17 or 18% of GDP. And the other 17, 18% are dominated by what I call services with a strong public good characteristic. The shares of consumption here, I mentioned earlier that some of the shares of what you might consider basic necessities haven't been going down, but I do think it's important to understand that none of these commodity categories are anything similar in 2020 compared to 2010. All right, even food, alcoholic or alcoholic beverage, tobacco, and so on have experienced large changes in the structure of the commodities that make up those groups over time. All right, and especially if you get into electronics or transport equipment or machinery of any type, the quality of consumable goods has really changed in Thailand over the last 30 years. And we can't underestimate those effects. Unfortunately, even using constant values, if correctly measured, probably wouldn't account for changes in quality like that. Now, so you'd have the same problem whether constant prices were used or current prices are used. I also look at the share of government consumption. One thing that sticks out is a fairly large share for employee compensation, but that it declined over time. So the money being spent on government workers has gone down, and that the government spending, notably defense spending, went down, and that spending on health, right? Social protection and health. Those items went up the most. Thailand is a rapidly aging society, and that's important. One of the more important characteristics of Thailand is its very heavy dependence on commodity taxes, okay? This is extremely regressive. It hurts the poor a lot more than it hurts the rich, but that's the way it is in Thailand. High taxes on imports are another item I need to look at more, and particularly I want to go out and get the tariff revenue or the import tax revenue and divide it by the value of total imports over time to see the trends in that variable. I haven't gotten to that yet. Table 3 looks at exports. Exports are in this context interpreted as an indicator of production structure in leading Thai manufacturers primarily. Thai exports are dominated by manufacturers, to a lesser extent agricultural goods. A large portion of the agricultural exports, the food, other agricultural goods, are actually manufacturers, and Thai has an extremely vibrant agri-industrial complex that is very active in almost every province in the country, and some of its leading firms are in these industries. So those are very important exporters. Other leading firms in Thailand are in machinery. A lot of these are foreign multinationals. Thailand itself has big multinationals in chemicals and particularly in the food and beverage space. It used to have some bigger firms in textiles and clothing, but I don't see them anymore. There's a big difference. I use the World Trade Organization classifications of exports and imports because they're easiest to tie to the tariff data that I want to talk about later, and because they're reasonably aggregated and updated and easy to access and check. The Bank of Thailand classification is also a very useful reference. It suggests a slightly different distribution, particularly among automotive and export and electronics exports, and perhaps machinery and equipment too. I haven't looked at that closely yet. But those categories, the definitions of those kinds of categories typically differ among different classifications, and you need to be careful to be precise as to what you're talking about. Table 4 looks at capital stocks, capital productivity, and labor intensity. I use net capital stocks at current replacement cost as the best estimate of the capital stock and current values that I could find. I again am interested in using current values because I'm not really keen to be comparing the effects of deflators for capital with deflators for GDP with deflators for wages and asking which deflator is most appropriate in this circumstance. I simply don't have a good sense to choose the correct deflator in each of those cases. And I can think of all kinds of arguments to support all kinds of different choices. So I have chosen to use the data that I think have the smallest probability of being incorrect, in the sense that they are the closest to the number that is collected directly from firms and factories in surveys of those firms and factories. Okay. One of the important thing to emphasize that, yes, you do see the effects of the slowdown in private investment in capital stocks, particularly in the slowdown of private capital stocks. You also see that the sectoral distribution of capital is really, really different than the distribution of production, and particularly transportation and storage get much, much larger shares of capital than of production. And this is because of the large capital needs in those industries to produce output. That's reflected in these capital productivity calculations. These are estimates of average product of capital to give us an idea of how capital productivity changes over time. It actually has been relatively constant or trended slightly downwards in most of the sectors. There are pronounced variations across sectors and time, and I think data problems are an issue with those numbers as well. However, I don't really have enough intuition about the way capital stocks are estimated and the alternatives that might be possible to make any clear statements as to whether one of these numbers are wrong or incorrect, or whether one of these trends seems unreasonable or not. Frankly, the numbers seem generally reasonable, and I suspect they were estimated using techniques that involved assuming reasonable values for value added to capital ratios or capital to output ratios, whichever way you want to talk about it. Finally, it's also important to look at capital intensity, which also varies greatly across industries, being much higher again in the capital intensive sectors of mining and transportation and storage in particular, but also information communication is remarkably capital intensive in Thailand, according to these estimates. Manufacturing began as a relatively or a much more labor intensive industry, but it's always been a little more capital intensive than the average, whereas agriculture has always been quite labor intensive in Thailand, and that makes sense. The next table is something I don't know what to do with, and one of the questions I'd like to ask the audience is, should I throw away this table or not? One of the problems is it has lots of missing observations, so it's a real eyesore. The transportation indicators are interesting, and I want to keep them in some form. Perhaps I could combine them in another table and then just talk about the R&D data without showing them in the paper as necessary to facilitate the discussion. I still don't have a good idea about how to integrate the R&D data, but I'll talk about that in the second. One of the more important things, however, are these data on infrastructure, particularly if you look at transportation infrastructure. You see strong indications of big improvements in air capacity and container port capacity. But rail in Thailand is as bad as it gets. Okay, it's absolutely horrendous. It makes American Amtrak look efficient, and American Amtrak is pretty bad. So one of the big problems in Thailand, and I think one of the big reflections of the lack of priority of public good oriented or priority on public good oriented investments in Thailand is the failure to invest in substantial rail networks, particularly in the more populated corridors in the north and in the south around Bangkok. I don't know why this has happened. I suspect it's because bureaucrats and businessmen didn't figure out how to make enough money off of the various contracts. And I suspect also it's because the authority over companies and or facilities and or investments in and profits in industries like this tends to get really, really concentrated, which creates kind of perverse incentives. One of the biggest improvements in recent years in Thailand and probably everywhere else in the world is in mobile line, fixed line, and broadband subscriptions, particularly mobile and fixed broadband. But mobile is the main means here in Thailand. As you can see, by estimates of per 100 people, the subscriptions per 100 people, most people have more than one. Most people have 1.8 or 1.7 toward the end of the sample. And I'm an unusual person in that I only have one. So even, and this is a theme I'm going to emphasize with respect to a couple of other indicators, even though per capita income growth has been relatively slow, there has been market improvement in a number of other aspects of economic welfare in Thailand, and transportation, particularly air transportation and container port transportation, but also I would suspect that road transportation has improved dramatically during this period as well. And if you had indicators of road infrastructure, they also would show substantial improvement. On the other hand, again, rail in Thailand, the rail industry in Thailand is the most neglected industry in Thailand and among the most inefficient industries in Thailand and the world, period. Now, of course, I'm prejudiced. I'm prejudiced because I was so spoiled by the incredibly efficient Japanese train system, and coming here, you quickly get disappointed. The R&D expenditure data, frankly, R&D was so low up through 2015, I didn't even really want to include this. But Archanan, I'm writing this paper partially for a project that is being organized by one of our participants today, Archanan Kopaipun. And I need to include topics that I know he's interested in, and I know he has some interest in the developments relating to R&D in Thailand. And you do see market increases in recent years to up to over 1% of GDP now in terms of expenditures. That is substantially larger than in previous years. You also see indication that the government is very heavily involved in this, and that a lot of the research is also done by private firms, well, they say private enterprise units. These are either factories or firms. I'm not sure which. The higher education units account for the next part. But if you look at government funded research, it goes primarily to higher education and other government units. By area of research, most of it is done for experimental development, followed by applied research, and the smallest portion used for basic research. Whereas by field, natural sciences, engineering, and technology and experiment, natural sciences and engineering technology take the largest mark. I also have a few patent indicators. I should be able to backdate and update these indicators if I can find the correct old printed publications, but there are lots of discontinuities in these Thai series that I need to be conscious of. And I have a big black line here about one of those continuities, and that has to do with the labor force data, labor force survey data that were revised, I believe, after 2011, that the estimates for 2012 and later years differ. And that makes a difference, particularly for agriculture. And part of this drop off in agriculture from 14 to 13 or 15 to 13 million people between 2010 and 2014, for example, is the result of changing definitions, and particularly changing how part-time workers in agricultural households are counted in the labor force survey. As I will detail in some, as I will show in some painful detail in a few minutes, I think they still overestimate agriculture, however. And the main reason I think that is because I think the implied estimates of average labor productivity in manufacturing to agriculture, or the implied estimates of compensation per worker in agriculture compared to manufacturing, are just too small. I show this at the top of page 7 here. In the Thai data, the employee compensation data combined with the employment data suggests the agricultural workers make 64,000 or 64 times the amount of money that those in agriculture make. If we switch to the text, I think I have some further important details on that point. Okay. I painfully go through all of these details here. I don't want to spend all of our time talking about them. But the point here is that these ratios, compared to the other countries in Southeast Asia, or compared to similar ratios from other data sources, there are estimates of wage data in Thailand, for example, that show the average differential is quite different. Oh, here's what I was looking for. If you look at table 6, you realize that workers in agriculture earned only about 17,600 baht a year, which is about $500 a year, and way below per capita GDP, okay? On the other hand, if you look at surveys of agricultural workers who report wages in the labor force survey, the average wage, the wage only, not total compensation. Remember, this 17,600 baht is total compensation, including wages, payments in kind, and so on. And usually wage payments are only about half to 3/4 of total compensation for most Thai workers. Okay, so this number should be lower than, the 600,000 number should be lower than the 17,000 number, but it's not by a lot. Okay, one reason for that, of course, is that the labor force survey wage data cover only a portion of the workers that report wages, and I need to do some more work to investigate precisely what proportion of the workers are covered. In the years that I looked at previously, it was about 50%, and that was overall. In agriculture, I suspect the coverage is much, much lower, maybe as low as 5 or 10%. And if that is the case, you can certainly understand that the labor force survey, when they're asking for agricultural workers to report wages, only the workers with really good wages working for really good companies in really good occupations report, and thus the number comes out quite high. That is certainly a possibility. But still, the relative wage manufacturing to agriculture shouldn't vary that much. It just shouldn't. Not if labor markets are at all competitive. And my impression, again, is that, suggesting that manufacturing workers earn 20 or 30 or 64 times what the agricultural worker in agricultural earns, it seems ludicrous to me. It seems totally unrealistic. Suggesting they own only 2.6 times also seems way too low. The labor productivity differential of 8, 9 times, maybe 5 times in recent years, that seems much more reasonable. And in recent years, the Philippines also reports relative labor productivity that is similar in scope to Thai ratios. And after the revision, the Thai estimate of labor productivity in agriculture relative to manufacturing is more in line with other countries than previous years. Thus, I think it's clear that the revisions in the 2011 and later labor force surveys made a difference and improved the estimates, but I wonder if they're still not overestimating agricultural workers and thereby underestimating agricultural productivity and wages and compensation especially compensation when you pair the labor force data with the national accounts estimates. On the other hand, there may be big problems with these estimates of employee compensation in national accounts. I don't know. Okay, I've got an extra number here. I apologize for that. Okay. Now, the other part of these tables, okay, table 6 is done. Table 7 looks at some education indicators. Actually, some improvement in these indicators actually accelerated during the slow growth period. So this is another aspect of development that has improved, even though per capita GDP has been growing relatively slowly. And as we all know, per capita GDP is not the most important indicator in many circumstances for many different types of economic analysis. You look at health indicators in table 8, you also see market improvements. And again, these improvements sometimes accelerated toward the end of the period, despite relatively low growth. You see remarkable reductions in poverty, defined as percentage of households below the poverty line. You see a tick up here as a result of the crisis, but even that is not very large. So poverty remains much, much lower now than it was, if these numbers are thought to be accurate. And I have no reason to believe they are not. If you look at data on the labor share of income, if anything, there's data to suggest that that overall at least, you have slight improvements, slight increases, and that workers are getting a bigger share of value added than they used to. Perhaps one of the biggest surprises, given the large amount of assertions you read in the public literature, or the, how do you say, the, I'm not getting my word here, in the newspapers and magazines about Thailand, is that the official data on income distribution indicate clearly and unequivocally that household distribution of income and consumption expenditures is getting better in a wide range of important respects. The share of the lowest 20% of earners, the share of the lowest 40% of earners are rising. Share of the top 10, top 20 are falling, all right? Gini coefficients are falling for urban and rural households and for the country as a whole. These aren't fancy decompositions. Other papers do that. I'll add those references when I write this up. But the point is, there's really no indication of greater inequality. even if you look at per capita GDP growth across industrial clusters, you find suggestions that growth has been relatively rapid in relatively poor areas. And if you correlate growth rates for a given period, say 96 to 90, with GDP at the beginning of that period, say 90, you get negative and significant, well, I've measured the significance of them, but you get negative and relatively strong correlation coefficients of 0.5, 0.7 with minus signs on them. And in simple correlations like that, that's a bit unusual. And you also see it in the descriptive data I described. There are regional variations in inflation, but I find them hard to explain, right? And there are also countrywide variations in inflation. Obviously, this year, that was 2010, tended to be a relatively high inflation year across the country, but some areas, and particularly outside of Bangkok, the inflationary pressure was felt to a much greater degree than in Bangkok. Okay. Now, the important point here is that even though you do see relatively poor provinces growing relatively rapid, or relatively poor provincial clusters, here I haven't used the provincial level data, but rather the cluster data, because actually I think those distinctions are more relevant. And in some cases here, I've aggregated the clusters defined in the data published by the National Economic and Social Development Commission, to aggregate those to be a little easier to present and talk about. But and I also think those aggregations, again, are relatively meaningful, that you don't need the full provincial detail, and that variations among neighboring provinces often isn't that different or that large, but variation across 2 or 3 provinces away is often huge. And again, you see big differences in per capita GDP. You see particularly low per capita GDP in the poor South, where in addition to all the political turmoil domestically, you have an insurgency that kills people and has continued to kill people for more than 2 decades now. They keep trying to negotiate a peace, but I frankly get the impression that the Bangkok governments are not terribly serious about this problem. The Northeast is the other area that is notably poor, and Isan, as it's called, is a source of a lot of votes and population. So politically, it's been very significant source of support for the previous Prime Minister Thaksin and his political parties. And Thaksin, also being from the north, gets big support from the north. And this gives him majority in regions of the country where voters are most numerous. And this is a big political factor that has to be taking place. Traditionally, Thaksin and his allies have been less powerful in the south and in Bangkok than in the north and the northeast, but they recently won the Bangkok mayoral election with a majority, a strong majority, and expectations are that they will now win the next general election in 2023, assuming they are allowed to compete freely and fairly with the military-backed government that continues to exist. So one of the most important parts of the discussion that I didn't get to that I want to is about import tariffs and how Thailand retains extremely high import tariffs, and that one of the biggest things that Thailand can do in the future as it goes forward is to, oh shoot, I'm trying to share a screen. Just one of the biggest things that Thailand can do going forward to improve welfare relatively quickly and relatively easily is simply to drop all import tariffs to 0. I know that's might be thought of as an extreme proposal, but I don't think it's extreme at all if you understand the economics of being a small economic country in Southeast Asia that's very dependent on imports and very dependent on the world. In the conclusion, I go through, or the conclusion that I've first written, I go through, the first point is that one of the reasons for the slow growth is clearly military rule, and what that's done to expectations among investors and consumers, and particularly among borrowers and lenders, but that's hard to figure out. It's also hard to sort out from the long-term effects of the crisis. But it's clear that how this next election is dealt with in 2023 or whenever it happens is going to have crucial impacts on Thailand over the medium term. The important point here about policy is that recognizing Thailand is a small economy with no control over world prices at all right, it means you have to recognize the limits of your ability to deal with policy. The other tendency for Thai policymakers is that they do tend to over-regulate monopolistically competitive markets dominated by small producers and consumers, where the government literally has very little power to do anything whatsoever except make things worse. I want to talk a lot about oligopoly here. And this is something I need to add, and I have yet to get to. The long-term, sorting out, the long-term hangover of the MPLs, resulting both from the Asian financial crisis and the world financial crisis, is important, and certainly a very important part of the story. The pandemic and how to deal with it is another important part we haven't talked about, but I'm very interested to add. I don't know how to do that most effectively. Thank you.